The way that we're getting this information here is we're claiming that we have some impossibly high-level understanding of how the brain operates for each specific individual that we're looking at, right? And what we're able to do is we're able to kind of diagnose the current state of the brain. I don't think that the human brain can be parameterized or can configure itself in a particular way to give the individual it creates inside of itself the sense of what is actually occurring in this relationship. There's no system or physical operation occurring from our perspective within the paper that allows it to perceive the information written on it in the way that we think of information being perceived. The experience that is arising for us at this particular moment in time appears limited and isolated and single as a result of the particular function that this brain, which believes itself to be single and individual, is part of, or like is arising out of, right? Like our brain, the physical object of the brain is one of the layers of this function that is arising from much smaller layers. So things that are tangible that we can think of, like molecules, atoms, or, you know, like cells, and the varying parts of our brain that construct the brain, essentially, right? And then you can go smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. You can continue on infinitely. But the layer that we're at within this infinite chain gives us the perspective that we're currently at because of the structure of the brain, because of the current state of the brain in the fourth dimensional object, right? So again, like we were talking about last time, if we pick some arbitrary range, probably a small range, because that would give us a more precise kind of understanding of what's going on in the brain, from a moment perspective as opposed to like a couple moments perspective. I'm gonna pull a little moment out of the stretched human object, and we're going to inspect the contents of the brain. The way that we're getting this information here is we're claiming that we have some impossibly high-level understanding of how the brain operates for each specific individual that we're looking at, right? And what we're able to do is we're able to kind of diagnose the current state of the brain and then pull out all of this information about the current, not the specific discrete moment, but the kind of human scale ranged moment that we're pulling out of our fourth dimensional object of the human. And we're saying, this like physically configured brain has this internal experience, but when we jump to that internal experience, it's assuming something about the brain, right? And I think that this is where like a lot of the really interesting conversation comes in, because some would posit that like without a sufficiently complicated brain, you can't have consciousness, and others would posit that consciousness arises from a more fundamental a more fundamental aspect of reality. Now, I'm going to err on the side of a more fundamental aspect of reality, just because simply because I don't have a theory that allows me to have a brain that has some level of experience in the way that we experience it, except for the model that I have here, which requires the structure that I've been talking about. So let's talk about how this structure would allow the physical structure of the brain, which has these current parameters inside of it, to actually experience these parameters, right? To have a vivid experience of being an agent, of feeling like you are here and you're an individual and you're something separate from the universe itself. So let's go back to the explanation that I have about this data structure, quote unquote, and what it's doing and how it's acknowledging things. So if we take the brain and we place it inside of this data structure, this is our Neanderthal brain. And what we're saying, and remember, when I say the existence data structure, I'm not saying that there is an individuated existence data structure for every physical object that exists or piece of information in the universe that exists, rather that the entirety of the universe is encapsulated by a single existence data structure that provides acknowledgement of the entirety of the universe instantaneously and infinitely. Because from this perspective, we're not talking about any sort of passage of time. There is no such thing as time. There's only the contents and the acknowledgement of the contents, because without the acknowledgement of the contents does not exist. There cannot exist anything outside of acknowledgement, or outside of something that is acknowledging it. So I can't say that there's no observer watching it, because what I would argue is that from our human perspective, this acknowledgement is analogous or the exact same as having an observer viewing the contents. And that's kind of like the really like the metaphor for this example, but it doesn't actually line up with, I think, the underlying mechanism that's occurring that is outside our grasp. I don't think that the human brain can configure itself in a particular way to give the individual it creates inside of itself the sense of what is actually occurring in this relationship. But this is a high-level metaphor that we can use to kind of describe what is most likely happening given our knowledge about anything. So when we think about things like this, we can't take our traditional three-dimensional physical understandings of things and apply it to this. So when we say that existence encapsulates the entire universe, there is no divisibility of that existence. So it's not that this part here is a portion of the existence, or is a slice of the existence, or just like like one of the existence parameters. It is the existence, right? So there's no divisibility of the structure that is supporting all of the universe. With that in mind, what's happening to give the brain the experience and not just the kind of configuration of this information? So, we can have, let's say, like a piece of paper that has all of this information written on it, but is that piece of paper experiencing that information? Well, I would argue that the piece of paper is experiencing the information, but from the perspective of a piece of paper. And what I mean by experience is that the piece of paper, so let's just draw a piece of paper and it's got some information on it, right? The information from, like, if I'm a human and I view it and I read the information on the piece of paper, there's something in my brain that is operating in a particular way to give me the experience of information on the piece of paper, right? But on the piece of paper, there's no system or physical operation occurring from our perspective within the paper that allows it to perceive the information written on it in the way that we think of information being perceived. But the paper still exists because there is the existence data structure that is acknowledging the fact that it exists, right? So the perspective of the paper doesn't allow it to acknowledge the information written on it in the way that our brain is able to acknowledge information from a human perspective about information, right? But the paper is still acknowledging the fact that it's existing, not because the paper, so this kind of falls back into what I was talking about yesterday, where we need to be really careful with definitions here. Because when I say the paper, what I'm referring to is the kind of like the Buddhist or Hindu perspective of what the universe is that there's no like categorical separation between any of its parts. That is kind of an oxymoron. But what I'm saying is there are no parts. There's only a single whole thing. This is the paper. The paper exists, which is this part, by acknowledging the contents, which is the paper from a human perspective as we'd understand it, which is information written on the paper, right? But even though there isn't this like human perspective of a piece of paper constantly and always existing in the universe in order to allow it to exist, there is some level of acknowledgement from the structure of existence that allows the paper to exist in a paper-like perspective. And since the information in the paper is not operating in a particular way to allow it to have a more human-like perspective, it would be a very, it's indescribable, right? We don't have the ability to grasp what the perspective of a piece of paper with information written on it is. The individual sense of being a person that arises out of being a physical brain does not allow us to access outside of the contents within the existence structure that is acknowledging the contents.